All right. Well, let's dive into some of the typical tools that you're going to be using. We're not going to talk too much about Build Better here. We're just going to kind of go over some of the things that you've seen, and we're going to go over prompt engineering. And the main focus for this is really going to be kind of going through some of the use cases for prompt engineering, kind of what you've seen, and then also some of the model choices that you can use as you start diving into these tools. What's the difference between the Claude versus Gemini versus OpenAI? What are the differences between these different models that they have? Which ones should I use? Which models are going to be better at A versus B versus C versus D, and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to kind of go through that. The three tools that we're going to talk about today are ChatGPT, Anthropic, or Claude, the Claude models, and Gemini, which has their own kind of models from Google. And the number one thing to know is okay, which model should I use? Which one should I use, and which one's the best for my specific tasks? So the high level, we've talked a little bit about they're really good at prediction models. Every new generation of models, so from GPT-3 to 3.5 to 4, and let's say going on, there's usually going to be a generational change. So you can think of it not so much as like iPhone 14 to iPhone 15, but an iPhone 8 to an iPhone 10. That was a big change. I think it was actually an iPhone 7 to iPhone 10. It was a really big change, that iPhone X, right? It had a massive display, a completely different form factor, kind of changed the way that we did it. You're not going to probably see a huge generational change from BlackBerry to iPhone, right? Like that was even a bigger change. So these GPT-4, GPT-5, those models would probably be more in those consequential steps. And then we have these O1 models that have just kind of come out more recently. And on Claude, you're going to see similar naming convention. You'll have, instead of having, 4.0, and O1 and stuff like that, we have different models. There's the Haiku model, there's the Sonnet model, there's the Opus model, and then there's versions of each one of those models. And with Gemini, with Google, you have a few different models, but basically there's the Flash model and the Pro model. Is kind of what they have. But I think when you use Gemini, you're kind of stuck with either the Pro or the Flash, depending on what plan you have. So which model do you use? So the 4.0 model is just kind of the model it can consume anything. It can consume text, videos, audio, all that kind of stuff. And oftentimes these models are getting faster over each generation. And one of the things to remember when you pick a model, and this is just like super high level, so regardless of the names and all this kind of stuff, is if they're faster, they're often dumber. They're dumber models. And if they're faster, they often might be trained on something specific, but they're often just not going to be as good as their slower models. So it kind of depends on what you need. So the GPT 4.0 model, if I said, what is the average temp in New York City which is where I am right now, during winter, I'm going to get a really fast response. If I were to ask the same question, what about in California? It's not that much slower, but I am going to get a much longer response. So it might be a lot more thoughtful. It didn't clarify maybe specific boroughs, or it didn't clarify what might be specific conditions. Whereas the 4.0 model, you saw that it said, okay, well, California, there's the coastal areas, there's inland areas, there's Northern California, there's the mountain regions, there's the desert regions. And if I were to go even one step above and I were to do O1, let's say, what about Texas? I might even get a very similar response because there's not too much thought. There's not too much stuff that needs to happen around doing that. But you'll see here that it's actually thinking through. And you might, again, we'll have a little bit more of a considerate answer. But the difference between the O1 mini versus the 4.1 mini versus the 4.0 versus the O1 Pro, again, you're not going to see a huge difference between them if you're asking more basic questions. Because what the O1 mini does is it's a really small model. And some of these smaller models, they're focused, while they are less smart, less intelligent, they are often trained on specific things. Now, OpenAI has decided to train most of their mini models on coding, on engineering tasks, not necessarily on like math, but on like just coding. So like generating code, thinking through code. So it's much faster and is much better sometimes than even their non-mini model for specific things like coding. But for creative writing or creative tasks, you'd probably get a better result on their non-mini models. With Claude, they have more of a versioning is kind of the big step here. So while Haiku, like Sonnet, I think is their middle model. I think they have like 3 models. I think Opus is their largest. I think Haiku is in the middle. I think Sonnet is their smallest model. But the 3.5 Sonnet was considered their most intelligent model. So sometimes they'll kind of tell you like, hey, this is our biggest model, but this one's going to be faster. This one's going to be better at specific things. And so your Opus is like, hey, this is, if you have a really, really, really complex task, you should use Opus. But this one might be actually better at reasoning, might be better at thinking. So sometimes the versions can be a huge step up, like 4 to 5. You might never use 4 again. Once 5 comes out, you might never touch 4 again. Even if it's faster, even if it's slower, because it's just better overall. It's like more of a generational change. But these 3 to 3.5s, there might be some use cases to step that down and say, hey, maybe I actually want to use a smaller model for something specific. But for when it comes to product management, when it comes to creative work, we're often actually thinking about using the most intelligent models for everything. The most intelligent, the highest capable thing that you can imagine, because the more it thinks on something, the better responses we're going to get. So when we think about product management, when we think about product, I often am using the O1 model. I have access to the O1 Pro model. You can have access to it. It's just more expensive and it just thinks for longer. But these generational things, it's just longer time it thinks. The slower the response, the higher the intelligence. Now, the O1 models use things called reasoning tokens, and they are a little bit different, which is why it's not called GPT-5. It's called O1, because it is a little bit of a different model, different architecture than the 4.0 models. But let's use this in a real world example. So let's say I wanted to write a user research interview. So let's say I'm building a product for product managers and it uses AI, but I want to come up with some research questions for my first few users to interview. This will be a first time interaction. What should I ask them? Now, let's kind of go through and let's use the 4.0 model, because I want to show you something here. So it's updating the memory, which is just a feature of ChatGPT. So it will remember that in the future, and I can kind of decide yes or no. Okay, so it's giving me some, can you walk me through a typical day as a product manager? Any repetitive tasks? So those are pretty good questions. It's kind of long though. Like maybe there's not a lot here that I want to have. So maybe this is good enough, but maybe I want to dive in, or maybe I want to make these a little bit better. So I'll kind of like chat with it. One of the things that I can actually do is I can have it reflect, and I can start doing prompt engineering. So what you'll see here is this isn't prompt engineering. This is more about just giving it context. So you're kind of 2 jobs when you're talking to the AI, is either giving it context or giving it some type of focus, some kind of prompting in some direction or not. So if I were to go and let's use the O1 models, and this is going to think a little bit more, and let's start off for stretch, and let's give it to the O1 model. Let's see how it might perform better. So you're going to see it takes a little bit more time. It thinks. And while we do that, let's hop over to the Claude model. We'll use the latest one. Claude allows you to do writing styles, which is kind of cool. You can do that through prompt engineering. It's basically just doing the prompting itself. So, current workflow and play, walk me through your typical day as a product manager. What are the most time consuming tasks? Great. Fairly unbiased. That sounds pretty good. And you'll see here, walk me through your typical workflow, which steps do you. Very, very similar. It's not a difficult task. So you can imagine, it's not going to be so bad. But let's have it go through, and let me say, we generally are trying to avoid using things like pretend, particularly with the new O1 models, because it doesn't really help. these companies have caught on to how we're prompting, and they basically have said you don't have to do that anymore. You can just kind of tell us what the outcome you want and tell us how to do it. And the difference between saying like pretend like you're A versus just saying go do this thing is very, very different. So I'm not going to use pretend. I'm just going to say as if review these questions as if you're Rob Fitzpatrick, the author of the mom test, and give critique on how we can improve this. So what I'm asking it to do is I'm asking it to reflect, but I'm not just asking it to reflect on how could I make this better. I'm saying there is someone else out there that's much, much, much better at this than I am. And they will probably be able to critique this better than I could. So instead of me going through and saying, well, maybe this is a good question, maybe this isn't a good question, I'm going to have someone who I know is really, really good at this pretend to critique this thing. And I use it for marketing, for copy, pretend like you're Steve Jobs, or pretend like you can even ask it who would be the best person to review this and then have that person review it. But you'll see here, like I said, the first question was pretty solid. And then have you use AI-driven tools? Which tasks do you feel AI can improve can lead to a guessing rather than a fact? This is true. So there's mostly good questions, but first part is strong. Second part is where could AI help, which is leading, and speculative, which is true. So, okay, great. I love this feedback. And it even gave some revised questions. Okay, take that feedback and implement them into the questions and give me the top 5 questions I should ask everyone, and then the top 10 that would be generally good. So here I was like, okay, cool. I don't even have to review all this. I know that it's done its critique. I know that it's kind of thought through that stuff. I showed you some examples. Like I kind of agreed. I knew that it was going in the right direction. So I'm going to say, okay, cool. I want the final result now. Just give me kind of some of that feedback, and I want you to give me the top 5 questions. And again, it already knows that it should be thinking through this stuff as Rob Fitzpatrick. It doesn't have to kind of do any more thought to that. So the top questions would be, tell me about the last time you worked on a new feature from start to finish. What was the most challenging part, and how did you handle it? Now, this is in stark contrast from walk me through a typical product management workflow, which steps most time consuming. Now, why is that so much better? Well, that's so much better because instead of being a hypothetical scenario, what do you think? It's a realistic scenario. Walk me through, remember the last time you've done this. Did it actually come out the way that you did? Because oftentimes you want to challenge customers, right? This is just general product management. Customers generally don't really, they have a very idealistic view of their ability to, accomplish things in the future as anyone else does. And so it's sometimes much better to not challenge them about the future. Like, well, are you actually really good at this thing? Are you actually doing this thing, whatever it might be? And it's much better to ask them, look, you just walk me through last time what happened, what actually happened at your company. And then the decision-making process, time consuming. So it gave some pretty high level, like, hey, these would probably be the 5 top questions that you should definitely ask every single person. And then generally speaking, this would be some other questions that I would ask. This is great. I could use this today and start getting some stuff. And again, these different models, I could do the same thing on all these models. I could say, pretend to be Rob Fitzpatrick. How would you do this? Whatever it might be. So from a high level, that is generally prompt engineering. We just went through basically going from nothing to creating what I would say is a pretty advanced, high user experience researchers questionnaire. I mean, this would definitely pass my sniff test of being unbiased, of thinking through a problem in the right way, of not leading the horse to anything, or being pretty subjective on stuff. This is a pretty open-ended, allows you to kind of let everyone go to a specific direction kind of question. And I think this came out pretty good. And I didn't need to provide it a lot of context. I didn't need to say what my company really did or what we're working on or what we're trying to do. That's mostly because user research shouldn't have that context. But generally speaking, this is kind of what prompt engineering is, and how you can kind of work and do stuff. And I recommend this flow. This is probably 80 to 90% of my flow are these 2 directions. So the first thing I do is say, Start off with some basic context. I'm doing this thing. I'm working on this thing. I'm thinking through it. I want you to kind of start, make your first draft on it. And then from there, I give it kind of its ability to reflect on itself. How well do you think you did? How can we improve this? How can we think through this? Usually doing 1 or 2 reflections, even if you're on an O1 model, even if you're on the GPT-4o model, even if you're on the Pro model, having this intentional reflection with a specific person in mind, a specific kind of idea in mind, can be a really, really powerful way of getting these models to be much better. So whether you're using ChatGPT, you're using Claude, you're using Gemini, these steps can kind of get you going in the first place for really any of your use cases. Hopefully, that is a very helpful way of getting started with prompting and using these tools. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more into more practical use cases, writing PRDs and documentation, things that require a little bit more context. And we'll kind of dive into a lot more kind of user research and data analysis and stuff like that. But hopefully that answers the first half of your questions around prompt engineering and using these tools. See you in the next one.